Joyful, joyful, we adore you, God of glory, Lord of love. Hearts unfold like flowers before you, opening to the sun above. Melt the clouds of sin and sadness. Drive the dark of doubt away. Giver of immortal gladness, fill us with the light of day. That is the first stanza of a 5-stanza hymn written by Henry Van Dyke. It was adapted from Beethoven's Ode to Joy, and we know it probably as a perennial favorite, Joyful, Joyful, we adore thee. If you listen to the lyrics throughout the song, it's sort of a coming of spring. There's colorful imagery of new birth, a new creation emerging, and you sing it, you feel better. It's a peppy, positive, blue skies, birds chirping, flowers popping type of a song. But if you look closely at the lyric, it's actually one giant prayer. It's a petition to God. At the heart of the first stanza is the petition, and I'd like to read it again. Melt the clouds of sin and sadness. Drive the dark clouds of doubt away. A rather curious line in a hymn that is positive and peppy and colorful and coming of spring. But perhaps Van Dyke speaks for your own soul today. Does that prayer, that line I just read, describe your soul? Would you pray to God, God, melt my clouds of sadness. Drive the dark clouds of doubt away. Maybe that's you. Are you sad? Can your spirit be described in picturesque terms as dark clouds that need to be driven away and melted? What happens if you're in that state and God does not melt the clouds of sadness away? What if you walked into this room sad and dark clouds in your soul, and you had it yesterday and the day before, and you brought it in here, and you'll have it tomorrow and next week and next month? What if God doesn't quickly drive it away? Then what? If there is a 4-letter cuss word that Christians hate the most, I'm about ready to say it, so brace yourself, okay? Here's the 4-letter word that is arguably the most profane in the Christian dictionary. It's the word long. Particularly in the context of suffering. When our suffering and pain is long, when God does not drive sadness away and the dark clouds do not glide along like a quick Midwest thunderstorm, then what? That is precisely where we fall ourselves in Exodus chapter 2. That's precisely how the narrator describes the scene in verse 23. A long period of time. And when we understand what the period of time is, we understand he's describing a long period of pain and suffering of God's people, where God doesn't seem to answer their prayers, not for 4 minutes, but for 40 years. Well, I'm jumping a little ahead of myself of the story. The story actually starts with another time frame in verse 11. In those days. So that's actually the frame of the story. Verse 11 and verse 23. In those days, what days? The days of a long period of pain. Those days. That is precisely verse 11. Those days, specifically connecting to the previous story, where Moses, the baby, is rescued and becomes the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter, which would make him heir apparent to the throne, the greatest throne in the history of human civilization up to that time, the great superpower of Egypt. Now, for a moment, you take up pen and paper and become the lyricist you've always wanted to be. All of us now are storytellers just for a moment. How would you write the script after Moses, the baby, is rescued and becomes the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter, heir apparent? It would not be difficult to envision. I know how I would write the script and how most people would write the script. The young baby Moses grows up and Pharaoh dotes on him, bounces him on his knee. That grandson becomes the apple of Pharaoh's eye. If he does something wrong, all baby Moses, now the spoiled grandson of the superpower Pharaoh, all he has to do is bat his little brown eyes, and Pharaoh's heart melts like butter. Every waking moment that Pharaoh has is spent with Moses, grooming him to take over the throne. This is not far-fetched. If you read Hebrews, for example, when Hebrews tells us that Moses was trained in Egyptian schools and grew in Egyptian wisdom, he is clearly being groomed as the prince of Egypt to take over the throne. And so we don't have to surmise what would happen. I know how the story is going to end, right? I know how this script is going to go. I've seen it. I've watched Home Alone. The mean, stubborn, cruel grandfather absolutely falls like dominoes at the young boy, who then he has a change of heart, reconciles with his family. The credits go up. It's a great John Hughes film. Everyone is happy. And this is exactly how it's going to turn out. Pharaoh's bad heart is going to melt because of this good Moses baby, his now adopted son. He'll cave. He'll be remorseful of what he does to Israel. He'll actually make restitution. They'll both look at the sunset, arm in arm. Egypt and Israel will be reunited. Kumbaya, we are the world. And they'll go into the limelight, Moses running the superpower, going back to the days of Joseph the way it was meant to be. But as we read the text, this is not how it turns out. It should turn out this way. We want it to turn out this way. It's set up to turn out this way, but it doesn't. Nor is our life turning out that way because of suffering and pain. We would not write that script. C.S. Lewis said, pain is God's megaphone to rouse a dead world. Sometimes, if I'm honest with myself, and I usually am honest with myself, I just don't like what I say to myself, I wish life was like a Hallmark movie. I generally don't watch Hallmark movies because, number one, my wife watches enough for both of us. And number two, because I, in 2 minutes, know how this is all going to turn out. Two things that are absolutely predictable in every Hallmark movie. Number one, it will snow at some point. Doesn't matter if it's the summer, it's going to snow. And second, no matter how bad the acting is to convince us otherwise, everything's going to turn out right in less than 1 hour. But our life and Moses' life is not a Hallmark movie. So why did Moses foul up this script? It was given to him on a silver platter. I mean, why in the same hill would God rescue him from the butchery of his grandfather to save him for this moment where he could step it up, rescue Israel as the ruler of Egypt? Why did he mess it up? Well, we begin to realize it in verse 11. One day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people. That's not an accident. Notice how the narrator is guiding us. Moses, the prince of Egypt, the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter, being groomed for king of Egypt, trained in Egypt's schools. Notice how the narrator speaks, and Moses went out to his people and saw their burdens, something the writer of Hebrews will not let us forget. And saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. And he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hit him in the sand. Nice going, Moses. Now look what happened. Moses becomes vigilante, blows the whole gig, and what happens? In one fell swoop, according to verse 14, none of Israel trusts him. And according to verse 15, apparently Egypt doesn't either, because Pharaoh's going to kill him. So in one moment, God had it all served up. God saved Moses for this. God's plan was for Moses to become king of Egypt and rescue his people and have this great reunion with Egypt and Israel like the days of Joseph. And Moses in one moment blows God's plan, and now Israel doesn't like him. Egypt doesn't like him, so he splits the scene and runs 200 miles away to the land of Timbuktu, Midian, where he'll be forgot about. On the backside, as chapter 3 says, literally on the backside of Mount Horeb. How exactly is Moses planning to rescue Israel from there? I mean, this is western Kansas. This is the sticks. God had a plan, but apparently God can't foolproof it from a nincompoop like Moses. God ends up then frustrated in heaven, shaking his head, going back to the drawing board, gnawing on his nails, thinking how he's going to fix this. But that can't be right either, can it? An interpretation of God's plans that resembles a precarious Jenga tower in the last stages of the game. That can't be right. And it can't be right because it isn't right. That's not what was God's plan and how it works. So maybe God's ways are not our ways. The script would have been perfect had I wrote it, maybe how you wrote it, lined up, heir apparent, he fouls it up, got to split the scene, Israel doesn't like him, Egypt doesn't like him because of one moment. And then the next scene, it's curious, he tries to and does rescue another oppressed people, only to be rewarded for 40 years of being forgot about on the backside of Mount Horeb. What is curious, though, is the New Testament writers, when they recount this scene, and it's twice that they do, one at the preaching of Stephen in Acts 7 and the other in Hebrews, neither one blame Moses. In fact, the author of Hebrews lets us in on a little something when the author of Hebrews says, by faith, Moses, choosing rather to suffer with the people of God, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter rather than to enjoy pleasures of sin for a season. We get a little character of Moses in this episode. He defends the oppressed in both cases, both with the slain Israelite and the Midianite women at the well, but what's curious is that both stay oppressed. He, trying on his own, in his own works, in his own way, cannot liberate the oppressed. And so we fast forward, verse 11, after Moses had grown up, to then verse 23, the long dark years. This section of Exodus 2 resembles, if you are a Star Wars fan, between episode 3 and 4. There is that scene where Yoda dispatches Obi-Wan and says that we'll go into exile and sends the Wookiees into exile. And there is a long dark period now with the Jedi, only 2 survive actually, and we will not hear of them again for a long, long time in a galaxy far, far away. For a moment, so that we get the weight of this long dark years, I'd like to do something. The narrator doesn't. He just tells us this was long dark years. But if we piece together the New Testament time frame, we get a sense of just how long this is. The New Testament will tell us, Acts specifically, that 40 years had elapsed, so that in verse 11, when the writer says, after Moses had grown up, Acts tells us that growing up, he was 40 years old when this event happened. Then we are told that he spends 40 years in Midian, forgot about. 40 years. That is the specific timing of verse 23 during the long dark time. During those 40 years, Moses is forgot about. He is no longer the prince of Egypt. We're told in chapter 3, as I said earlier, he is on the backside of Mount Horeb. That's a literary device to tell you he's out in the middle of nowhere, forgot about. He actually, as an 80-year-old, we're told in chapter 3, is keeping his father-in-law's sheep. He doesn't even have any sheep of his own. He's a washed-up has-been. The failed, unsuccessful prince of Egypt is now a nobody, forgot about. For 40 years, nothing happens, but is happening. Because what the writer does for us in verse 23 of the long dark time is now connecting to the pain of not only Moses being forgot about, but the pain of God's people. The king of Egypt, Moses' grandfather, dies, and if they thought for a moment the day of liberation would come, they were sadly mistaken. Government changes, a new Pharaoh, and the same kind of pain. God still doesn't answer. The dark shadows of sadness still exist in Israel. Moses, in verse 11, celebrates his 40th birthday, according to Acts, if we believe that sequencing. And apparently, God does nothing to relieve the suffering of Israel. They're still enslaved. Moses blows out the cake of his 45th birthday. Still no prayer of emancipation for the people. Moses enjoys his golden jubilee, the big 5-0, and still no deliverance comes. 55 comes and goes to Moses, and still Israel is in Egypt, subservient to Pharaoh's pain. As 60 years old passes to Moses, another generation raises up in slavery, and another generation dies as slaves. 65, when most of us in this room are looking forward to retirement, Moses is still working on his job as a shepherd of his father-in-law's sheep, and Israel are still working on bricks. 70 years old comes, and Moses is still the shepherd, and Israel are still slaves. 75 candles are lit for Moses. 1 year, and Israel cannot celebrate anything as they're still in chains. Year 80 comes, and God begins to work publicly. Brothers and sisters, I do not have to tell you this, but I'm going to. Pain is a brutal teacher, and God's ways are not our ways, and His timing is not our timing. Few Christians, very few, in spite of what you've been duped, Few Christians will live this life of the faith in this world having a mountaintop to mountaintop, mountaintop, high experience, one high after another, where it's just pure exhilaration, complete answered prayer. Every day they pray it. Great bountiful harvest of fruit. Everything is great. Very few Christians experience that. Some do. But most Christians, if I am a student of history, most Christians, and you are probably one of them, like Moses here and like Israel here, where much of our life, if we're honest, are in the long, dark years, where we don't understand why God serves up pain and why God doesn't blow the dark clouds of sadness away. Why, when we pray and we try to do things, it's like nailing Jell-O to a tree. There is something symbolic of the season we're now in. I was talking, I think, to a sister in Christ today about this very issue when I walked in. The older I get, when Christmas is done, spring cannot get here quick enough for me. I did not used to be like that. And particularly if it doesn't snow, then I'm in perpetual gloom. Part of this is because my physical frame cannot handle it anymore. My respiratory wears out quicker. I cannot take the cold, dry air. My allergist actually has recommended me move to Florida. That would be the best thing for you. But as is a lesson in nature, so is a lesson in grace. We often as Christians experience long, dark seasons. 4 months is one thing. 40 years is quite another. In his wonderful book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, if you're a fan, you remember how C.S. Lewis describes Narnia when God, Aslan, is silent. Remember? Always winter, never Christmas. It's always snowing, it's dark, it's gloomy, but it's never Christmas. That's how it's described when the White Witch reigns. But there is a scene where people say, Aslan is on the move. He's now broke his silence. And they know that because of what? The snow begins to melt. The green begins to pop up through the carpet of the snow. Flowers begin to bud out. Trees begin to bud out. Birds begin to chirp. And finally the winter dissipates and Aslan is on the move. Now we can see him. And Lewis does a wonderful job of enveloping nature and grace together. Life is not always easy. And if you're in the long, dark years now, let's give some lessons before we close and get to the climax of this story. Some of these, in fact, all of them, if you're members of the family of God here, they are not new, they're not revolutionary, they're just good reminders. If you are in the long, dark time right now, just remember that often there are no quick fixes, hence it's called long. Moses might have thought he could accelerate God's plan by killing the Israelite. That didn't work. That somehow he could get out of this oppressed moment by defending the oppressed women of the well, and instead he got 40 years of desolate time. Please remember, and it's a good reminder for me as well, joining you in this plight, that the long, dark years sometimes do not have quick fixes. And we like quick fixes, don't we? We like our fast food restaurants where if we sit at the drive-thru of McDonald's and if they don't get our order in 40 seconds, we have an anxiety attack. We like our instant coffee made at Starbucks. We like our quick delivery from Amazon. Just this week, my son of mine, my only begotten son, opined, "Dad, is there some way that we can just get instant hot water? I can put my cup underneath at the house and get it quickly." I'm like, "Well, son, in the old days, when we didn't have feet and walked uphill in the snow, we put a pot on the oven with water in it, and we turned up the oven, and we waited 5 minutes, and it got our water. But, well, that's slow. I wish it could." So I join here. We're an instant gratification culture. We want everything now. And this story is a reminder that our God chooses to operate differently. Moses would choose suffering. A second reminder I'd like, not only do long, dark years sometimes not have quick fixes, but if you're in the long, dark years, it may seem that you're gone or God is gone as well, but you are not forgotten. This is very important. Verse 11 lets us know that Moses went out to his own people. And he has to go to Midian, and we get a taste of how Moses felt in these days. That he too probably prayed like the hymn writer, "Melt the clouds of sin and sadness, drive the dark of doubt away," and it didn't happen. We know that because he gets married to a girl by the name of Zipporah, and they have a son. And in the ancient world, you gave names for symbolic reasons. And he gives his firstborn a name. It's very deliberate. In fact, the rest of his life, every time, Moses, as a decrepit 120-year-old, if he called his son his name, he would be reminded of this moment in his life, because he names his boy after this moment. And it tells us how Moses felt about this long, dark years. I am a resident foreigner in a foreign land. Hardly a ringing endorsement of his situation, but an honest assessment of his life. I have nowhere to call home. I'm restless. Where is God? What is he doing? Who am I? The ambitions of Egypt had subsided over this 80-year-old. As I mentioned a few weeks ago, the first 40 years of his life, Moses thought he was a somebody. The second 40 years, he was reminded he was a nobody. But the third and final 40 years, it's getting ready. God's going to teach him that God can make a somebody out of a nobody. Finally, if you're in the long, dark years, third reminder, you can always pray. And praying in pain works. Now we get to what I believe is the climax of the story. It sets us up for chapter 3. Up to this point, from a literary standpoint, God is silent in chapter 1 and 2. He never communicates with his people directly. By the way, he'll never communicate with his people directly until they're out of Egypt. He will use Moses to communicate. But it is verse 23 that sets in motion the moment where God does reveal himself in one of the most dramatic pictures in all of the Bible, the burning bush of Exodus 3. But the burning bush happens because of what happens in verse 23. The wording of verse 23 is important. Maybe it describes your soul today. There is a threefold emotional prayer that the writer wants you to realize what the people of God are going through. 40 years between Moses' murder of an Egyptian to him being on the backside of the mountain, and preceding that 400 years in Egypt. And they come to God in their plight, and they say, verse 23, they moaned, they shrieked, they called for help. The first word reflects their burden. The second word reflects their hurt. And the third reflects change. They went up to God, and we know they prayed in pain because it is expressed twice. We're told the reason of their prayer. Do you see it? Twice we're told, because of their slave labor. They want out of this. This is hard. They have suffered and hoped that changes of government would do it, and it didn't. Changes of generation would do it, and it didn't. Changes of policy would do it, and it didn't. The rescue and adoption of the Prince of Egypt, one of their own, would do it, and it didn't. And so they are now going to God in pain. This isn't light, chipper, church camp, spiritual narcotic high, happy clappy. This is a prayer in pain. Political change doesn't bring change. Prayer makes the difference. And notice, it is not an accident, God's response. It is also a threefold response. God heard, God looked, God knew. Now, from a storyteller point, you get the picture. God is distant. God is not talking to them. God is silent. Now he comes and he looks down to see. Now that distance begins to get close. This last word, God knew, to know, particularly used in the Old Testament, speaks of intimacy. It's the same word, by the way, in Genesis, where Adam knew his wife and she conceived. It is the same word used in Psalm 1:6, where there the righteous says, God knows the way of the righteous. What does that mean? It's not intellectual knowledge merely. Here to know. Is God coming down to painful, in pain, suffering children, his children? And it's coming down and stooping to their level to see what the situation therein is, to feel that situation, and more, to know what it's like to be them. This is not some ogre distant God who is unmoved. And this is made apparent if you go to chapter 3. There, God actually speaks to Moses and tells him why he's coming and revealing himself as the I Am. This is chapter 3, verse 7 and 8. What does he say? I know their suffering, so I have come down. I, to use a Bill Clintonism, feel their pain. God comes down, he sees them, he comes to their level, and he knows what it's like to be them. And he says there to Moses, I know their pain, and that is why I've come down to reveal myself. So in the long, dark years, you can always pray, knowing that praying in pain works. There are all sorts of reasons to pray, of course, but pain is a big one. For those, and I just talked to one Friday, my charismatic friends that are always happy clappy and think that if you're melancholy, they translate that to sin. They're going to have a problem with, say, the entire first volume of Psalms. Anyone ever read Psalms 1 through 41? They're all Psalms written in pain. And thank God for David. And you know that and I know it. Because when you're in pain, what do? You know what you do. I do it. You go to the Psalms. And you read David and think, he's saying what I'm feeling. So there are many reasons to pray, and pain is a big one. Brothers and sisters, God in His amazing way of providence gave us all a lesson of this, if we needed one, about 4 weeks ago. 4 weeks ago, approximately, I and my only begotten son and only begotten daughter were sitting watching Monday Night Football, and the Buffalo Bills were playing the Cincinnati Bengals. If you watch that game, you'll always remember it. It was about 7 minutes into the first quarter, and one of Buffalo Bills' secondaries, DeMar, I believe that's how he pronounces his last name, goes up and makes a routine tackle, and he falls down, and he gets up, and he falls backwards and collapses. And as soon as I saw this, as soon as he did it, I turned to Noah and I said, this ain't good. This is not normal. You don't fall that way. Believe it or not, I used to be an athlete. Keyword used to be. The older I get, the better I used to be. But that's a whole other story. And I took a lot of hits. I had a lot of concussions. When you fall that way, the way he did, something is seriously wrong. And we all, in a few minutes, knew something was seriously wrong. As paramedics are pulling a truck out on the football field, as a nation, an internet, that everybody that watched are gasping in horror as medical personnel are performing CPR on a football player on a football field. These grown men who basically get in a car wreck every play for money. Grown men who could pick up an oak tree and shove it down my throat anytime they wanted to. Grown men who are physically, they have muscles in places I don't even have places. They are phenomenal to watch. Were reduced to tears. Absolutely helpless. And in that moment, without being told, what did they do? We saw it. It wasn't us versus them. It wasn't they're my enemy, now I want to crush them. It was in that moment, everybody on that field kneeled and began to pray. And soon thereafter, you watch a sports commentary. They break away from the game to try to give airplay, to try to give brevity of the situation. And a commentator, this is unprecedented. They've never seen this before, trying to give some sort of dead air commentary. And one commentator throws his arms up and says, look, can we just pray? And does this on the air, and 364 days of the year he'd be fired, scandalized, demonized, politicized, but he prays. And we can sit here, I know we can say, well, who are they praying to? Do they know it? Did God answer? I get it. My point is, they defaulted to something the human psyche knows. When they're desperate and helpless, you can always pray. Because to pray admits, I am needy and helpless and can't get out of this. Prayer is to the spiritual realm what a hospital bed is in the hospital. Keep paging the nurse. I need medicine. I need help. Pray without ceasing. There is a difference between Uncle Sam and Christianity. Uncle Sam will only take you if you're healthy. Jesus will only take you if you're sick and in need of Him. And Israel is at the point, we need help. We can't do anything. And God hears. Prayer not only reflects our needs, but it reflects the purposes of God. Notice, if we're confused about this, we have verse 24 staring us in the face. God heard their cry and remembered His covenant. Now, the storyteller is painting a nice picture. He's not trying to be a theologian, that comes later, but he's painting a picture. And the picture here is God is off somewhere, minding His own business, maybe helping somebody else, and Israel's over here, forgotten about, distant, suffering, and God's in the other room doing what God does. Maybe He's, busy helping some other civilization. And they say, hey, and maybe his phone goes off, and I have to remember my word. So what the lyricist is telling us is God acts, and this is the real comfort, because God will never break His word. And so God acts because, hey, I'm never going to let them go. Because I gave my word to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and to all of Abraham's children through the promise, which is, wink, wink, you and I. That's why Exodus lives for us. You're in a long season of pain. The clouds of sadness hasn't been driven away. Guess what? God hasn't forgot about you. And if anything, He will come in His time because He will stay true to His word that He never breaks. There are some interesting comparisons to Moses and God. In verse 11, we're told that Moses saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, his people being oppressed. In chapter 3, verse 7, the same word is used where God says, I have seen the affliction of my people in Egypt and will act. He says it again in verse 9. In verse 12, we read that God struck down an Egyptian. The same word is used for God with His people in chapter 12, where God strikes down the firstborn of all of Egypt. In verse 17, we're told that Moses stood up and saved the women of Midian watering their flocks. The same word is used in chapter 14 for God, where God saved Israel from those that oppressed them, the Egyptians. In verse 19, we're told that an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, the testimony of the women. In chapter 3, verse 8, God says, I will deliver my people out of the hand of the Egyptians. And on we go. But beloved, it doesn't stop there. Long, dark years continued for God's people. We fast forward 1,000 years later to a time in Luke chapter 1, I'd like you to turn there, where an obscure Jew, a man, we're told, of great piety, who just happens to be a Jewish priest, who just happens to have his name pulled in a paper, rock, scissors game, and he has to go up to the holy place and pray. If we know our Christmas background, we know this man is Zacharias. There in Luke chapter 1, verse 13, we're told that Zechariah was troubled because he hears a word from the Lord, and he will soon be told that his wife will get pregnant. So the birth of John the Baptist is foretold, and the reaction in verse 12 is that Zechariah, before these angel of the Lord, was troubled, and fear fell upon him. But the angel said, now mark this, do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard. Same language, by the way, of Exodus chapter 2. Do not be afraid. God has come down, saw your plight, and heard your prayer. Now, what prayer did Zechariah pray? Well, given the context, we know what prayer, but let me give you some biblical background of what prayer I know he would have been praying that he didn't think would matter at all to his personal situation. If you come back to the prayer, you'll find it at the end of Malachi, chapter 4. You can turn there, or you can just hear me read it. Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament. After this is mentioned, after this is written, guess what happens? 400 years of a long, dark time in Israel's history. 400 years where not one prophet will prophesy and say, this is the word of the Lord. Can you imagine living in that spiritual slavery where one generation comes and one goes and they never hear a prophet of God during those intertestamental period? And it ends before this spiritual exile with Malachi chapter 4. Behold, this is verse 5, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And this is the prayer that Zechariah is praying. We know that because of what comes next in Luke 1. Zechariah, it's not an accident, is a man of piety, is a good Jew, he's a priest, and he goes up into the inner court of the Lord and prays. And one of the prayers that he's praying every day of his life, that Orthodox Jews still pray today. If you have a non-believing, non-Christian Jewish friend, and they celebrate Hanukkah, they set the table and they have a chair. And that chair is vacant. You know whose chair that is? Whose chair is that? Elijah's chair. It's empty because they're praying the Messiah comes to save them and rescue them. And they know, because they know their Bible, although not that good, otherwise they'd believe in Jesus, that when the Messiah comes, we know he's going to come because Elijah's going to precede him. And this is what they would have been praying. Zechariah would have been praying this. And guess what? 400 years comes and goes from Malachi. God doesn't answer. They're praying it every day. God doesn't answer. No Messiah. Dark place. No, not even a prophet. And Zechariah goes up one day, and the angel of the Lord comes down and says, in Luke chapter 1, we read it, I've heard your prayer. What prayer is that? Your wife's going to have a baby. You're going to name him John. And guess what? He is Elijah. Because the Messiah is coming. And his name will be Jesus. That comes later in Luke 2. And so God has answered your prayer. 400 years, all of a sudden, God shows up and light comes into the world. So Jesus becomes the new Moses. I referenced a moment ago Winter. There is a British playwright by the name of J.M. Barrie who once addressed St. Andrews University and said, God gave us a memory so we would have roses in January. If you're in pain today, remember your God. He will keep his promise. He will answer prayer, and winter will end. I have 2 dogs, Luna and Dublin. The problem with dogs is their poor sense of timing. Take Bum, for example, who belongs to some friends of mine. They claim that Bum is an Australian blue heeler. I have no way of verifying this since I know nothing about Australian blue heelers. I am solely taking my friend's word on this, who have proven to be honest in all other matters of life. Bum is 7 years old, which is young for an Australian blue heeler. Some of them live 25 years. That's 175 years to you and me. They're the Methuselahs of dogs. Bum got sick last year. Her stomach began to swell, and my friends thought she was pregnant, which is a reasonable assumption because in addition to their poor sense of timing, dogs have loose morals and will mate rather indiscriminately. So they took Bum to the veterinarian, and the vet told them that Bum was terminally ill and would likely die within the next 2 weeks. He treated Bum, charged them with a monstrous sum of money, and then sent Bum home to die. Of course, my friends were gutted and devastated, and they began to grieve in those few days and weeks, and they began to pamper Bum. Which we do have a tendency to do, don't we? To spoil our loved ones who are sick. I mean, when was the last time you saw a kid with polio get spanked? You see what I mean? As I said, most dogs have a poor sense of timing. This was certainly true of Bum. 6.5 months after her death sentence, she lives on. She is the healthiest dying dog I know. Now that they have spoiled her for so long, Bum has lost all sense of discipline. She chews on clothes that she never used to chew on, and when her owners give her a stern look, she looks up with them with sad puppy dog eyes, and they melt like butter. In a word, Bum has overstayed her welcome. She is the mother-in-law who came for a week's visit and stays for a year. I was talking with my friends about her. They told me how they went through all this grieving process 6 months ago when they thought Bum was going to die. Now, they're over their grief and wish that Bum had the decency to expire. Until she does, their lives are on hold. They can't take a vacation because they'd have to put Bum in a kennel. If she died in some small cage surrounded by strangers with a huffing strange pit bull down her throat, they would never forgive themselves. So they're in a real fix. This is why dogs are so infuriating. Get a cat. A cat has the good sense to succumb in a tasteful and timely manner. Dogs are dense and they can't take a hint. So now my friends are actually upset with Bum. I know how they feel. My brother got sick when I was little, but he came close to dying. But he didn't. He made a recovery, but not before we missed our entire summer vacation. That made me mad. I mean, some people are so insensitive. The problem of here, of course, is one of expectations. Bum's refusal to die on our schedule reminds us that pain in this world isn't always predictable. Things don't always turn out the way we plan. Marriages that begin with tender words and long conversations often dwindle to grunted grunts and stunned silence. The exhilaration of the Christian life that begins with a contagious fervor sometimes ends with heartbreak and disappointment and cynicism. But the reverse is also true. Tragedy can be turned into victory in a few short words. Consider, for example, Abraham and Sarah. They braced themselves for a life without children. No sticky kisses, no one-tooth baby grins, no lap-sitting grandkids. Then God paid them a visit bearing a It's a Boy cigar box, and their life changed forever. And now consider Moses and the children of Israel. For 400 years, they remained in slavery, the last 40 praying, hoping God would show up, and he never did until one day he burned a bush and said, "I am who I am, let my people go." And the people went. Life in God's reign is kaleidoscope in nature. We try in vain to picture life's next scene while God's grace is in the background resetting it. Some dogs just will not die, and some pain will not stay that way. Father, I thank you for this assembly. I thank you for their hearts, and I pray especially today for those here, the redeemed, my family, some who are here, and the dark clouds of doubt and the sadness have not been drifted away. They've come in here sad. They're going to leave here sad because of their trial. Pray you would encourage them that long, dark time will not always be long and dark. And they can always pray to a God who will always stand by his word and work for them. This I pray in the name of Jesus our Lord, and for his sake. Amen.